host, I guess. Basically, what this panel is, I have written a few books about animation, about specific shows. I've written a series of books about My Little Pony and a book about Monica Magica. And I'm currently working on a series that's going to take me most of a decade to finish. The first book will probably come out next year, depending on how long it takes me, called The Neuropocalypse of '09, which is studying the DCAU. And so this panel is kind of, for my writing, I'm going very detailed. I'm doing one chapter per episode, which is why it's going to take me a decade to cover the whole entirety of the DCAU. But for this panel, what I wanted to do was kind of use some of the same themes I'm studying, but do it across the entirety of the DCAU. So kind of a high-level view of the same themes. So what I'm going to do is, I'm very brief. Is there anybody not familiar with the DCAU, what it is, hasn't seen it? Okay, so I'll skim through that part really fast and just really briefly what the DCAU is. Then I'm going to talk about the approach I'm using, which is a technique called psychochronography, which sounds much scarier than it is. Then I will talk about the three major themes that I see myself exploring and how they are portrayed in the DCAU. And those will be deferred apocalypse, heroic trauma, and the protector fantasy. And I will explain what each of those is as I go through them. So, really quickly, the DC Animated Universe. It's a meta-series of cartoons that ran in the 90s and 2000s. It started in 1992 with On Leather Wings, the first episode of the Batman the Animated Series. It ended in 2005 with Destroyer, the last episode of Justice League Unlimited. Most DC Comics-based cartoons from that time period are a part of it. Not all. The two main exceptions are Teen Titans is not a part of the DCAU, and the League of Superheroes is not. Is that what it's called?
Legion of Superheroes?
Legion of Superheroes, thank you, is not a part of the DCAU, although it has exactly the same art style. And in fact, was originally planned to be part of the DCAU, and then for whatever reason they changed it. So it's Batman the Animated Series, the new Batman Adventures, several animated Batman movies, Superman the Animated Series, Static Shock, which is a really weird case, because originally Static Shock was not part of the DCAU because Static was not a DC Comics character. He was a Milestone Comics character. Between the first and second seasons of Static Shock, which was produced by the same studio as the DCAU, Milestone got bought by DC, and Static Shock became part of the DCAU. That's why in the first season, there are references to Superman and Clark Kent as fictional characters, but in the second and third season, there's crossovers with Justice League.
And Batman Beyond.
And Batman Beyond. Batman Beyond is the next series. Batman Beyond, and it also had a movie, Return of the Joker, which is amazing. The Zeta Project, Justice League Unlimited, a web series called Gotham Girls, and also, I left it off the list because it didn't fit and it's really minor, but there's also a web series about Lobo. That is like the official DCAU. There's also comics, video games, all kinds of other stuff that's kind of satellite part of the DCAU. And there's certainly a strong influence of the DCAU on DC Comics' direct-to-video animated stuff that they've done in the last few years, but those are not part of the DCAU, at least as I'm treating it. You can tell because they have the wrong Green Lantern.
Hey.
Yes.
The Justice League Crisis on Two Earths
Is not part of the
Well, but
DCAU. It has a lot of similarities. It's got a lot of the same people working on it, but it is not a formal part
it
of
was
the
originally
DCAU.
supposed to be, right?
It was originally planned to be.
At the end, it led into Justice League Unlimited, like when they bring up the other superheroes into the Watchtower.
Exactly, and that was the original plan, but it's not actually. It didn't actually gel out that way. So moving on. Psychochronography, and I'll explain why there's a TARDIS there in a minute. So psychochronography is a technique based on psychogeography, which was conceived by an early 20th century radical art movement called Situationist International, who sought to overthrow capitalism through spectacle. So their goal was to basically stage massive attention-grabbing events in ways that would call attention to how capitalism is bad, and that would cause capitalism to fall. One of the core techniques that they developed, which is the core of psychogeography, is this concept of the derrière, which is walking through an urban space according to some unusual logic, some set of rules that is not the normal way a person would walk around in the city. And writing, thinking, making art about the things you encounter in doing this, the relationships that were not obvious walking around the city normally, but that are revealed when you do it in some other way. A few years ago, a man named Philip Sandefur developed a technique called psychochronography, which combines psychogeography with an idea from Alan Moore, yes, the same Alan Moore who does comics, called idea space. The idea is that instead of walking around a physical space that really exists, you walk around the space of ideas. You take a fictional work or a pop cultural artifact that exists across an extended period of time, and you use that to explore the history happening around that object. So the reason there's a TARDIS here is because the first true psychochronography was Sandefur's TARDIS Eruditorum, which is a psychochronography of Doctor Who. He covered every single story in the entirety of Doctor Who from the beginning to the 50th anniversary, and used it to explore the evolution of British utopianism over the latter half of the 20th century and early 21st century. So the idea is, as I said, you're like a psychochronography of the DCAU. I'm not telling the history of the DCAU. I'm not telling you how it was developed. I'm not telling you, then this person came on board and was hired and they ran into these problems with production on this episode. What I'm doing instead is looking at the ideas in each episode and how they relate to the history happening around the DCAU. Move on. So, as I was saying, episode by episode through the entirety of every series. I am currently, I've been doing it since last November. I've been writing. I've been doing one episode a week. I have gotten about a little less than halfway through the first season of Batman the Animated Series, which the first season of Batman the Animated Series is a bajillion episodes long. It's 65, which is pretty long. So yeah, my estimate is that it will take about 9 years. Especially because I am diverting into discussion of adjacent topics and events where appropriate. For example, I covered Beware the Grey Ghost, which is the episode that has Adam West playing Batman's childhood TV hero, or playing the actor who played Batman's childhood hero. And so before I could cover that, I had to do an entire chapter on the Adam West Batman. Similar things like that. The other thing that happens, so it'll be where an idea is connected. So Adam West Batman is connected to that episode by Adam West. The other thing that happens is when it's just timing connects them. So for example, an episode aired on the day of the 1992 election. So before I covered that episode, I covered what was going on in the 92 election because there's some significant history going on there that relates to ideas I'm talking about the show. I covered the founding of Cartoon Network because it happened at around the same time as an episode aired, and much later, Cartoon Network is going to become important to the DCAU because it's where the DCAU eventually aired. It started on Fox, moved to WB, and ended up on Cartoon Network. And as I was saying, I'm going to weave the history of the 90s, what's called the long 90s, because the idea is that, for example, what we think of as the 60s, and that kind of mood and world and that kind of thing, that actually really starts in the late 50s and ends in the early 70s. Like, decades don't neatly fit into 10 years. There's usually a little bit before and a little bit after. So the long 90s, at least where cartoons are concerned, starts in 87 and basically ends somewhere around 2005. So the DCAU almost covers the entire island. Now, moving on to the first theme I want to talk about, deferred apocalypse. So we have apocalypse. I'm going to be having a lot of fun with that one. So, there's something my stepmother once said to me that has always stuck with me as being very, very true, because I grew up in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 90s. The 90s are really when my world was set, musical tastes were set, all that kind of stuff. But I remember the 80s. And I think she makes a good point when she says that you cannot understand the 90s without realizing that nobody expected to survive the 80s. The world was supposed to end by the end of the 80s. You had, ever since Silent Spring in the late 60s, you had mounting concern about environmental issues. You had the ozone layer was decaying and global warming was coming, except that there were also people saying, no, global warming isn't coming, but we're going to have an ice age. Yeah, I know there's still people saying that, but back then there were still people taking seriously saying that. You had the rise of the religious right in the late 70s and early 80s, and associated all kinds of doomsday prophecies, predictions. There's always been predictions of the world was about to end, but it really started building up to a fever pitch in 80s. There is the concern about the satanic panic. That's not really an apocalyptic concern. That was people worried about their kids getting hurt. That wasn't really people worried about the world ending. But the big one is the big one, the nuclear war, the nuclear holocaust. The Cold War was supposed to end with the US and Russia nuking each other so hard that only people in submarines would survive, and their job was to nuke anybody else left. It was called mutually assured destruction. That was actually the US's battle strategy in the case of a nuclear war with Russia was our submarines will kill the survivors. And then it didn't happen. The Cold War just fizzled out. It turned out that Russia had been having massive economic problems ever since the oil crisis in the 70s and just been hiding them. And it fell to pieces without us doing anything. It just fizzled out. The environment got better. I don't know if you've ever seen photos of what New York looked like in the early 80s compared to now, or what LA used to look like in the early 80s compared to now. There's been, things are still not perfect, but there's been a lot of improvement on that front. And the 90s happened. All of a sudden, people were standing around in 1990 looking at each other going like, well, shit, now what? We're alive. The world hasn't ended. What do we do now?
I thought we were going to be in Mad Max.
Yes, and I'm actually going to talk about Mad Max a little bit. Because the thing is, we actually want the apocalypse. Here's the thing about the apocalypse. The idea of the apocalypse originates in a genre of literature from the ancient Near East. It starts a few centuries before the Common Era, ends a few centuries after. It's a period of a few hundred years when there was a massive outpouring of literature, of apocalyptic literature, being produced by people living in what is now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, that part of the world. And we know that there was a massive amount of it because like 20 of them were survived. Which, after 2,000 years with no mass production of, which means there was only 1 or 2 copies of each of those, that's a lot. There must have been a lot more. Now, 2 of them survived because they were copied lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. Those are the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, which are kind of the all-time bestsellers of the genre. And they're actually both very much, this whole genre, like all the examples we have, what they're very much about is about hoping for the destruction of the world. Because then that clears the way for a better world after. All those horrible people that are oppressing us, the evil empires that conquer us, my boss that yells at me for being late to work, all those things, all those injustices, we wiped away by some great cataclysm, and we'll build something better. Even post-apocalyptic stuff is wish fulfillment. Zombie movies are very much about, God, I wish I could kill my neighbor for not returning my stuff. Oh wait, now I can't because he's a zombie and so there's no guilt. Mad Max is about finally getting to prove that I am as tough as I claim I am in this horrible environment. I will be able to live and travel and I will be heroic. The Stand. Very, very good example. So we want the apocalypse, and so when it gets delayed, when we expect it and it doesn't happen, there's some real disappointment here for a lot of reasons. One is that the grand battle of good versus evil didn't happen. Where the heck was the forces of good? They were supposed to show up and save us by now. They were supposed to fight this great battle, and they didn't. Which means, are we going to have to keep fighting this forever? Is there no final battle? Are we going to have to keep going forever? Or even worse, are there no forces of good? Are there no real heroes? Is the Punisher the model for every hero in existence? Is Image Comics going to rise and give us heroes who are as bad as the villains? In the 90s, yes. Because good didn't show up for us. There was no great final battle. And you've got also this concept of what we could call the monstrosity of survival, which I want to pull up my notes because I had some good examples here from the DCAU. So there's this idea that our survival is wrong. Our survival should not have happened. So you start getting survivor villains. You start getting villains who are models of survival gone wrong. And the obvious one, the one who nobody had heard of or cared about prior to the 1990s, prior to that he was a joke character. He was just silly. And then the 1990s turned him into one of the best written, most prominent villains, Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze is, remember when I told you that people were worried about an ice age? Mr. Freeze is that gotten up and walking around. We weren't supposed to survive. We were supposed to be killed by being frozen. And here either in an ice age or a nuclear winter. And here he is, surviving. And that's so wrong. And he's so creepy. And you get other examples of this too. That's great, but I do too. The Joker used to be this sadistic murderer with a little bit of clown-themed stuff. That was the version of him given to us in the 80s by Alan Moore and Tim Burton. But now he's something new. The Mark Hamill Joker is not any kind of Joker we've seen before. He's not the purely sadistic murderer with a little bit of clown on top, partially because children's cartoon and they wouldn't allow it, but partially because they found something more interesting to do with him. He's also not the completely ineffectual clown with a thin veneer of criminal on top that he was in, say, the 60s. What he is an elemental force of chaos. He is the post-apocalyptic chaos that was supposed to happen and did not get to. And again, he shouldn't exist. He's wrong. He's monstrous. And you get Blight in Batman Beyond, who again, radioactive wasteland, gotten up and walking around. An end of the world that shouldn't happen and didn't, so it became monstrous. And of course, I told you I was going to keep coming back to this pun. Darkseid is the apocalypse itself. He is all apocalypses. He is the essence of apocalypse. And so he gets deferred and deferred and deferred and deferred and deferred until finally he's all that's left at the end. All right. Now closely tied to this idea of we shouldn't have survived, is a kind of survivor guilt. Is everyone familiar with the concept of survivor guilt? Okay, good. So it's this sense, we should not have survived. Why did we survive? Why are we still here?
Why did we survive?
This hurts. And why did we survive? It's usually why did we survive when others didn't, but there's also, it can manifest after a trauma that had no deaths. You can still get survivor guilt as, I shouldn't have survived. Which brings us to our next concept. But before we get there, let's do some case studies. Let's talk about Superman, and let's talk about my favorite version of Superman's origin story, All-Star Superman. which tells his origin story in 9 words and 5 panels. Doomed planet, desperate scientists, last hope, kindly couple, Superman. That's the entirety of his origin story. Because that's all you need. Because you've heard it so many times. You've seen it so many times. They show his origin story in every single episode of Superman the Animated Series, because Krypton blowing up is the first thing you see in the opening credits. You've seen it told in, like, every movie franchise that's been done with him has started with his origin story. The comics have told his origin story dozens of times. It's just repeated over and over and over again. And what it does, the destruction of Krypton effectively ended this infant Kal-El. He goes back, he uses the name sometimes, people refer to him as that sometimes, but essentially the person Kal-El would have been if he had grown up on Krypton never gets to exist. Instead, we get Superman and Clark Kent, which they might be the same person, depending on the writer. Sometimes they're the same person. Sometimes Superman is real and Clark is a mask he wears. Sometimes Clark is real and Superman is a mask he wears. Sometimes they're 2 separate people, like in that ridiculous movie where they fought each other. I forget if that was 3 or 4. But what's interesting is that with the way they refer to it, Clark Kent is Superman's secret identity. We never say Superman is Clark Kent's secret identity. The implication there is that Clark Kent is the creation. Now, certainly you can write it differently, and plenty of people have, but the way we talk about it, the assumption going in, and we do that with every superhero, we always say the superhero's name, and then they have some person's secret identity. We always talk about it as if, in that phrase, the superhero is the real character, which of course they are. They're what we're here to read about. We're not picking up a Batman comic to read about Bruce Wayne. We might enjoy reading about Bruce Wayne, we might be interested in it, but without Batman, Bruce Wayne is just some rich kid who's whiny and sad about his parents. And that's, you could do an interesting story about that, but it wouldn't be a superhero story. And so we have this constant retelling of his origin story that shattered him, that split him into multiple pieces. And sometimes it's overt, but we also retell it we recreate it in new ways. The death of Superman. After his origin story, the death of Superman is probably the most famous Superman arc in comics. What happened in the death of Superman? Superman was destroyed by Doomsday, the end of a world. Gee, what is that referring to? Maybe Krypton blowing up? Well, also it's the 90s, so maybe that apocalypse that was supposed to happen and never did. And what then happens? Symbolically, he's divided into multiple characters. Each of the 4 Superman books was taken over by a person claiming to be the new Superman. And I can't remember all 4 of them, so I'm not going to try. But, excuse me, please stop interrupting. Okay? Please. And so, essentially, it's retelling that story of Krypton being destroyed and Superman being shattered into multiple people. In the DCAU, we get the literal apocalypse as your stand-in for Krypton. It is what keeps attacking Superman, keeps hurting him, keeps coming back, is this destruction, this end of the world. Apocalypse even gets to blow up Krypton style. And hey, guess who is present and causing havoc when Apocalypse blows up Krypton style? Brainiac. What is Brainiac's origin in DCAU? Oh, he's from Krypton, and he was covering up that it was going to be destroyed, and he survived. Lex Luthor goes back to Apocalypse, not Krypton, to find remnants of Brainiac. And the last thing is, memories of Krypton hurt Superman. The obvious literal thing here is kryptonite. But it's not just kryptonite, it's Brainiac, who I just mentioned. It's Metallo, who's fueled by a chunk of Krypton. So much of his, it's the 2 people whose names I'm forgetting, but they were Superman 2 references, the other Kryptonians that showed up in 1 episode and created havoc. All these echoes of Krypton keep coming back to Earth. His origin story keeps cycling around, sometimes literally and being retold, sometimes symbolically to hurt him again and again and again. Let's move on to another character. Batman. Batman's origin is the murder of his parents. Batman does not come into being the first time he puts on the Batsuit, years later. He does not come into being when he has some kind of experience involving the Bat, either while pondering what he's going to do, or years earlier as some kind of childhood trauma. No. He outright says in the episode where they're all turned into children, he hasn't been a kid since he was 8 years old. Because when he was 8 years old is when he became Batman. It's when he was forced to grow up. It's when he was forced to create this protective shell that became his entire personality. And just like Superman, this origin story keeps circling back to hurt him again and again and again. Batman the Animated Series is full of flashbacks, dreams, references to his parents being killed. He dreams about it, for example, in Two-Face. He dreams about it when he gets a Black Mercy put on him in Justice League. Again and again, we cycle back to that event, or refer back to it. Ones like, I haven't been a kid since I was 8 years old, or I'm building a world, or no, I've built a world where no kid will ever lose his parents to a punk with a gun, from the episode of the Justice Lords. It comes back again and again. There's also, just like with Superman, recreations of his origin. In the late 80s, early 90s, in the comics, the Joker attacked and horribly injured Batgirl, which is why she later became Oracle. And he murdered the second Robin, Jason Todd. That is some punk with a gun, or a crowbar in the case of Jason Todd, or Tyra, one of two, taking away the people Batman loves. Instead of his parents, this time he's taking away the closest thing he has to children. The DCAU has their own version of this. In Return of the Joker essentially destroys Tim Drake as Robin, turns him into an echo of the Joker, and then he's forced to retire as a result. And just in case there was any doubt that this is where Batman comes from, this murder of his parents, this is going to keep coming back again and again, Cadmus and their Project Batman Beyond, as told in the episode Epilogue, a key element of their plan to create a new Batman, they did genetic manipulation and all kinds of sneaky stuff and manipulations to put oh my god, I recognize his name. Somebody give me his name.
Terry McGinnis.
Thank you. They put Terry McGinnis in a position to become Batman, but then one of the key elements was killing his parents. And that was where they had to back down on that. And then his father gets killed anyway, and he becomes Batman. Because that's what happens. That's where Batman comes from. That's the origin story, and so if we have a new Batman, he has to lose at least one parent to a punk with a gun. So where am I going with all this? This is the heroic trauma model of superheroes. This is something that has been discussed in the literary analysis of comic books. The idea is, comics depend on continuity. Comics run for really, really long times. The only thing that runs for a comparable length of time to a comic is a soap opera, and even then only really successful. And there's maybe 2 or 3 soap operas at most that have run as long as Superman or Batman. Comics run for a really long time, and they depend on this idea of continuity, this idea that the Superman you are reading about today is the same Superman you were reading about a month ago, and a year ago, and that maybe even your grandparents were reading about. That there's, events that really happened, and will be referenced back to. Problem is, that kind of continuity is impossible across these time scales, and especially with multiple writers. It just can't be done. So there's inconsistencies. There's people who just don't want to be shackled by what was established before. So you get, so it requires, you have to do retcons all over the place. Occasionally you might have to do a reset. DC Comics likes to do this. we're going to reset everything, start over from the beginning, and it'll be less confusing, except that because we don't communicate well with our individual editors and writers, it'll actually be more confusing. Has anyone ever read anything about like Hawkman in the 80s? Oh my god, that was a mess. Impossible to follow. And you also get sliding time frames, which is how Marvel usually approaches it, which is the idea that no matter when you're reading the comics, Spider-Man has been Spider-Man for 10 years. Even though there's been like 50 times he celebrated Christmas. So you get kind of mixed of those. For example, in the 90s, DC Comics decided that they were going to do the same 10-year rule. Superman has been Superman for 10 years. All other superheroes came in after him. And of course, then they had to do retcons and resets to deal with all the confusion that introduced. My point is that comics don't work like history. They're not a linear sequence of events. They're more like memory, where we keep going back to old ideas. We keep remembering things, but every time we remember them a little bit different. The way you remember things is influenced by what's going on around you, by how you feel. You might cycle back to certain memories that just nag at you again and again that you remember all the time. Other things you might forget. Some things you might choose to forget. Some things you might forget accidentally. Sometimes your memory will contradict itself because you're a flawed human being. Your memory isn't perfect. And that's where we get the heroic trauma model. Because what the origin story then plays out as, if we're considering the comic book to be history, the origin story of virtually every superhero is an intensely painful experience. The end of their world, the murder of their parents, getting dosed with gamma radiation, being on a spaceship that goes horribly wrong, getting taken hostage by originally Vietnamese soldiers, like in the movies Afghanistan. You know, all these different superheroes have these intense traumas, which are what create them. To give another example that's perhaps even stronger than the one I was giving with Batman, Spider-Man does not become Spider-Man, the superhero. He does not become a superhero when he's bitten by a spider and gains spider powers. He becomes a superhero when Uncle Ben is killed. That's the moment at which he starts doing superheroic things instead of being in it for himself. So it's an intensely painful experience that transforms your identity or fragments your identity. The person you are after is not the person you were before. You're no longer Bruce Wayne, you're now Batman. You're no longer Kal-El, you're now Superman and Clark Kent. And the memory keeps coming back again and again and again and again. This is trauma, psychological trauma. That is the term in psychology for this kind of experience. When we talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma is the event that creates that. The constant retelling of the origin story functions like a PTSD sufferer's flashbacks. Superheroes are created and created by and constantly reliving trauma, which then raises an interesting question. Oops. Let's go with that. Yeah. There we go. Okay, so this raises an interesting question because one of the things we like to say about superheroes is that they're power fantasies. That the idea is that you, reading the comic book or watching the cartoon, are wishing you had the power of a superhero. To go out and rescue people and be a hero and have adventures. Here's the thing though. Yes, sometimes. I think it is almost impossible to argue that nobody ever reads about or watches or experiences superheroes as a power fantasy, especially young children. Studies have shown that when young children talk about superheroes, read about superheroes, it's very much a power fantasy. With adults, less often and less so, because the way adult readers of comics mostly engage in them is not as wish fulfillment, but as something to curate. It's the geek approach. It's, I know everything about this character. And we'll get back to that a little bit later when we talk about what fantasy superheroes actually are. But then what comes with power fantasy, because of course we all have power fantasies. I mean, I talked about with the apocalypse. We all wish we had power. We had power over our lives, over the world around us. We all wish that the world wasn't. You know, we all have visions of what we want the world to be. That we think we're right, we think we know what would make this a better world, and if we just had the power to make that happen, then people would see and they would understand that we're right, and they would agree with us, and they would accept this new world that we've created. So, for example, maybe you wish that you had the power to just impose a more environmentally conscious system upon the world. Or maybe you think that's a bunch of leftist garbage. What you think the problem is that we shackle the markets too much, and we're not a meritocracy. So you wish you had the power to impose capitalism and meritocracy on the world. Or maybe you wish you had the power to impose revolutionary anarchy upon the world, tear down all the systems, tear down all the governments. Or maybe we need to be tough on crime. That's the solution, more order. Maybe you just want to get revenge on the people who hurt you. You don't care about all this political stuff. Or maybe you just want people to listen to you and you don't even care why or what about. Or maybe you want power for its own sake, so people will do what you tell them. Or maybe you just want to get laid. The point that I think I have made here is that when adults have power fantasies, though they may not admit it, most of the time what they're imagining themselves as is super villains. As people who use their power to impose their vision upon the world no matter what other people think or want. Which is not to say that these causes are wrong. Which is not to say that they're right. Which is not to say that supervillains are good. They're not by definition. They're supervillains. They are. But very, very often, they are taking causes that we might have in real life, or things that we might want in real life, and using power to force their way upon the world without concern for what other people want. That's what makes them villains, is that they don't care about other people getting hurt or what other people might want or feel. They just want what they want and they're going to make it happen. And let's admit it, sometimes we all wish we could do that. We'd like to think that we wouldn't, but we also like to imagine that what if we did? Wouldn't it be so much better? I'm just imagining it. It's not like I really want it. I'm not a bad person or anything. And you're not, as long as you just imagine it. So let's talk about another case study. Let's complete Trinity. Let's talk about Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman's creator, William Moulton Marston. As a general rule, if people know about William Moulton Marston, they know three things about him. They know he created Wonder Woman. They know he invented the lie detector, which I'm going to have to check my notes, but that is actually wrong. He did not. He created a component that is used within the lie detector. The actual inventor of the lie detector was John Augustus Larson. And the piece that Marston invented was, I don't have it written down. But he only invented one piece of the polygraph, which does not actually detect lies, it detects truths. And the last thing is that he was poly and submissive. He was in a lifelong BDSM relationship with two women, one of whom was legally his wife, the other of whom was a student of his. But, so, which is, I mean, even nowadays, that's pretty weird. In the 1930s, that's pretty weird. The fact that he got away with it is kind of impressive. And what often happens is people will take these facts and try to say that that explains the creation of Wonder Woman. Oh, obviously, Wonder Woman is a superhero dominatrix. He's just living out his fantasy. Her lasso is just a lie detector. And while there's a little bit of truth to that, it's actually more complicated than that. Wonder Woman is really as much connected to his professional work as a psychologist as she is to his personal life. In fact, what might be most accurate to say is that everything, his personal life, his professional work, his creation of Wonder Woman, was all tied to a single ideological vision that he was very stable and that he kept very clear throughout his life. And There's a great phrase to describe it. Phil Sandifer, who I mentioned earlier, also has a book about Wonder Woman called The Golden Thread, which I highly recommend. It's one of the best histories of Wonder Woman I've ever read. And he described it, I love this phrase, matriarchal bondage utopia. This is what Marston thought the world should be. And if he were a supervillain, that's what he would have forced the world to be. In his book, The Emotions of Normal People, written many years before Wonder Woman, he mapped out what he thought was kind of a two-axis system of human behavior. Now, it's notable that these are behavioral tendencies, not personality traits. So the idea was that in different environments, people might show any of these. But that in a given environment, a given person would usually show a particular one. And the way he mapped them out was whether they were active or passive, and whether they were opposed to whatever stimulus was happening in the environment, or aligned with whatever stimulus was happening in the environment. So the first one he talked about was dominance, which is opposed and active. In other words, it is imposing your will on the situation, which is exactly what I was just talking about with supervillains. Marston, in his book, is very negative about dominance. The examples he used are things like boys in a schoolyard beating each other up, violence and pain and anger and destructive behavior. Next, we have compliance, which is opposed to the environment and passive. In other words, it's caving in to dominant behavior even though you really want to do something else. It's being cowed, it's being beaten down by the dominant and going along with it, not because that's what you want, but because you feel like you have no choice. Marston regards this as being functional. It's not actively destructive, but he also makes a point of pointing out that this is a life of fear, it's a life of unhappiness, and in later writings, he even said that it actively encourages other people to behave in a dominant way. So, as an alternative to compliance, he starts talking about submission, which is aligned and passive. In other words, it's happily and willingly going along with what another person wants. Not because it's necessarily what you want, but because you want to do what they want. Because of whatever reason, because you feel that the impulse to be nice to them, or because you want to make them happy, or for whatever reason, you decide to willingly and happily allow their will to override yours. Marston is very positive about submission. Gee, I wonder why. Arguing that it's a natural and healthy state of being that encourages harmony between people and happiness. And he then goes on to talk about last corner of the graph, inducement, which is aligned with the situation and active. And what inducement is persuading other people to submit. It's persuading other people to willingly go along with what you want. Not forcing them, just finding ways to make them want what you want, to guide them gently into doing what you want because they want to do what you want. He regards it as a healthier, less violent, and more harmonious alternative to dominance, and equates it to things like motherhood and persuasion, politics, seduction, as opposed to dominance, which is things like violence, war, destruction. Pretty clearly, Wonder Woman was made as a model of inducement and submission. She wants to change the world to be less, she wants to eliminate the patriarchy, but she wants to do it. She's not going to go out and impose it. She's not going to go out and start, punching senators and tearing down buildings. She's not going to attack the Pentagon. That would be dominance. Instead, she's going to serve as an example. She's going to say, look at me. Look at what I can do. Submit to the world I'm trying to create. Just go along with it and see how much happier you'll be, how much better things will be. This, in turn, leads us to the solution to this problem of the power fantasy. If power fantasies are really more villains than heroes, then what kind of fantasy is a superhero? And that's where we come to, surprise, surprise, the protector fantasy. In essence, the protector fantasy is a fantasy that someone with power won't dominate. They'll induce. They'll take care of us. They'll care about us. They will protect us from the harm that could happen to us in this world. They won't go out and violently change the world into something new, because new is scary. New is the apocalypse. But they'll come in and keep us safe, so that it doesn't matter the problems of the world, that there's crime, that there's violence, that my boss is mean to me. They'll come in and just shield me from all that, and I don't have to worry about it. And I don't have to feel guilty about it because nobody's getting hurt. They're taking care of everything and solving the problem for me. That's why we like our heroes traumatized. Because then they know what pain is. Then they know what it is to be hurt, and they develop the empathy to protect us. Spider-Man, again, is the model here. You know, with great power comes great responsibility. That's what we want our superheroes to believe. And in the DCAU, that's Flash. Flash is the perfect expression of the protector fantasy, and the episode Flash and Substance is the perfect demonstration of what it is we're fantasizing about. And this moment I've captured is my favorite part of the whole thing. This is my favorite Flash moment. The scene where he almost merges with the Speed Force and saves everybody from Luthor Brainiac is great, but this beats it. Because this is him even caring about the villains. He's even protecting the power fantasies from the harm caused by their own exertion of power. He's calming them down, talking to the trickster, helping the trickster instead of merely beating down on the trickster. And it's a beautiful, beautiful scene. Moving on. So, how does this all link together? Well, superheroes are kind of like walking deferred apocalypses because they're constantly saving the world. They're constantly preventing power from causing change. They're preventing the apocalypse over and over and over and over. In Hereafter, which is a great episode, that's the one where Superman gets transported into the far future, causing all the heroes to think that he's dead, which again is a retelling of the death of Superman and thus of his origin story. But what he ends up in is a far future where Vandal Savage has accidentally brought about the apocalypse. And Superman and Vandal are the only people left. And after what appears to be, based on his beard growth, months, he finally meets up with Vandal, and they don't relate as hero and villain. They relate as the only two people left in the world. They talk to each other. They work together to send Superman back into the past and undo this terrible future in which the villain actually brought about the apocalypse and created the change. There are no heroes and villains anymore if the apocalypse isn't deferred, because the whole game is the villains trying to create change, trying to create the apocalypse, and the heroes trying to protect us from it, trying to protect us from anything that might hurt us, and unfortunately, one of the things that causes hurt is change. It doesn't matter how you want to change the world, somebody's going to get hurt by it. And so you have to be, if you're really out trying to make the world a better place, you have to be willing to accept that there's at least a couple of people, and maybe they're terrible people and you're okay with it, but there's at least a couple of people for whom it won't be a better place. And the thing is, the superhero protects even then. Which then brings us to Destroyer, which seems like a challenge to this notion, because in Destroyer, which is the last episode of Justice League Unlimited, the last episode of the entire DCAU, the villains and heroes team up to fight Darkseid. The massive worldwide battle between an army of heroes and supervillains working together in teams of 2 and 3 against the forces of Apocalypse. And that seems to kind of disrupt this argument, but what I would counter with is saying that Again, Darkseid is the ultimate apocalypse. He's the villain's villain. He is change so massive, so final, that no one wants it. And the thing is, heroes fight each other all the time. I mean, villains. Heroes too, but villains fight each other all the time because they have competing visions of how they want to change the world with their power. A huge part of Justice League Unlimited is the villains fighting amongst themselves. Lex Luthor and Grodd fighting over who is going to run the Injustice Society, or they go through like 5 different names for it in the course of their conflict. And eventually, the villains dividing up into factions and fighting with one another. So it's not that far-fetched that the villains would be fighting Darkseid. What makes it interesting is that they're working together with the heroes to protect the world. But isn't that really the ultimate protector fantasy? Because the whole point of the superheroes is that they have power and use it to protect us and prevent apocalypse. So the idea here is that for a brief moment, even the villain, as a reward to the heroes for protecting even the villains, even the villains will protect the world from apocalypse in this most extreme case. Which brings us to one of the greatest scenes in the DCAU and contender for the single greatest Superman moment ever. The world of Carnage.
Can't you see that it's hopeless?
That man won't quit as long as he can still draw a breath. None of my teammates will. Me? I've got a different problem. I feel like I live in a world made of cardboard, always taking constant care not to break something, to break someone. Never allowing myself to lose control, even for a moment, or someone could die. But you can take it, can't you, big man? What we have here is a rare opportunity for me to cut loose and show you just how powerful I really am.
Superman, who you can make a strong case is the superhero from whom all others are derived. You can also make a strong case for the Scarlet Pimpernel, but that's a different story. You can also make a strong case for Gilgamesh, but that's getting a little out of the weeds. Superman is here saying, because through the entirety of the DCAU, ever since the beginning of Superman the Animated Series, his powers have been depicted very inconsistently. He seemed to get stronger against stronger villains and weaker against weaker villains, so there was always tension in the story. Now we know why. Up until that moment, we had never actually seen him at full power. That was his first time really cutting loose, because he was scared of hurting the villains, or bystanders. He was scared. He was deliberately holding himself back, and that's why he's more powerful against stronger villains and weaker against weaker villains, because he's holding himself back more against people he doesn't think can take it. And in deliberately holding himself back, he's even protecting the villains. He's saying that even though you have done terrible things, even you are worthy of my protection. Everyone is worthy of my protection. I protect everyone. One second, I'm almost done and then I'll take questions. That's really the ultimate in the protector fantasy, that he will, no matter what you do, no matter how terrible a person you are, somebody will save you. Somebody will come in and help you. So that creates a natural tension between protector fantasy and the desire for apocalypse. that I was talking about at the beginning of the panel. On the hero side, you have this protector fantasy, but the protection necessarily entails maintaining the status quo. It necessarily means no apocalypse, no massive change, no new, better world. This world continuing forever, but you can imagine that somebody will come in and help you before things get really bad. The villains represent apocalypse and power and real meaningful change, but the price, because we've constructed superheroes as protecting us, the price is that anyone who sets out trying to make a better world will eventually go off the deep end and become a supervillain within comics, within the DCAU. Nobody is allowed, the classic example is Reed Richards in Marvel. Reed Richards, no matter how brilliant he is, no matter how much great technology he develops, he is never allowed to actually solve world hunger or find a good alternative power source or anything like that. His intelligence can only be used to prevent change, to fight villains. It's the same thing in DC Comics. Doesn't matter how many people with magic and super science and technology from the future are running around, Oracle's legs cannot be healed. She can be reset to be Batgirl again, but nobody can ever actually manage to heal her legs. Nobody can ever bring Bruce Wayne's parents back. Any other character can come back from the dead as much as you want, but if somebody died as part of the origin story, they are gone and never coming back, except possibly as evil robots in a terrible Spider-Man story.
What will I say?
Because meaningful change would end the story. It ties us back to the thing that comic books run for incredibly long times and depend on this idea of continuity. If the apocalypse happens, if an entirely new world is created, then what? No, the closest we can get is a near apocalypse, which allows us to transition into Batman Beyond. But we never get a real change. The hero can never truly recover from their trauma because the world can never be truly fixed. Look at old Bruce in Batman Beyond. Every bit of softening up that happened to Batman over the course of Justice League, every bit of coming out of his shell, every bit of, maybe I can trust other people, maybe I can work together with other people, wiped away by events we never got to see, by the Near Apocalypse of '09, which is where I got the title of this project. It's whatever it was, it's what caused Batman to leave the Justice League. That all wiped away, and he's reset to the cranky, solitary, isolated individual he was in On Leather Wings. He can never heal, because if he did, the story would end. There would be no more superhero because the trauma is what creates the superhero. All right, we are pretty much precisely out of time. So very quickly, where to find me? I've got one panel left at this convention, Star Trek 9/11 and the Age of Perpetual War. That's tomorrow at bumfuck AM in the Phoenix Room, which I think is this, no, it's 2 rooms down. I will be at other cons. I am definitely going to be at Intervention, Anime USA, MagFest, and Anime Boston, which takes us to next March. There may be some others. JetAblue.com is my website. Because JetBlue.com was already taken, it's a redirect to JetBlue. I post Near Apocalypse articles every Sunday. Vlogs every other Wednesday. I vlog contemporary animation. I just finished the first season of Steven Universe, which, oh my god, that was amazing. And just started Gravity Falls. And 4 days a week I post some other stuff. YouTube.com/userprobor is where I post my vlogs. I also am trying to get a Let's Play series off the ground called Replay, where instead of joking around or doing how to play the game, I do more analytical kind of stuff. But my Patreon is $2 short of the level needed to get episode 2. So, not happening yet. Patreon gets you basically access to my buffer. I write Near Apocalypse about 4 months ahead of what I post on the website. Patreon backers can see those articles as soon as I post them. Slightly higher level, they can see my vlogs, which I do about a month ahead. That's it. Thank you all. And let's get around. I hope you enjoyed this. That's all right.